From Thunder Bay's news source, the TV News Hour.
It was one of Canada's worst air disasters, and it happened right here in our own backyard. The 1989 Dryden air crash shocked the Northwest and had a wide-ranging impact on airline safety around the world. Tonight, in part one of a four-part series, TBT's Jonathan Wilson revisits the crash and talks to some of the survivors as they mark the 20th anniversary of the event that changed their lives.
March the 10th is a day that always brings back haunting memories for the survivors of Air Ontario Flight 1363. Dan Godden, his wife Susan, and then teenage daughters Laurie and Danielle were heading to Whistler for March break back in 1989.
The day was a bit of a blur. Started off with a lot of school break chaos and continued that day, and was greatly interrupted by a very tragic accident.
The Thunder Bay to Winnipeg flight, carrying 65 passengers and 4 crew members, was running late. It took off at around noon from the Dryden airport during a heavy snowfall. Donna Wilson says the liftoff was short-lived.
I was trying to fall asleep and I woke up to screaming. And there were trees coming towards us, and I just thought, okay, I'm going to die now.
Tina Tucker was with her future husband when the plane went down in the snowy forest. He helped her escape the wreckage.
I was buried in snow, debris, trees, luggage. You know, it was all on top of me.
Tucker, Wilson, and the Goddens all managed to escape through gaping holes in the downed aircraft. A total of 45 people survived, while 24 were killed in the crash or the resulting fire. Dryden firefighters Jeff Robinson and Ken Kurtz were among the emergency crews who rushed to the scene that day.
It was quite the sight to see those people just walking out and towards you, and we were glad to see people walking towards us. That meant at least there was some survivors, because it sure looked pretty bad from the amount of smoke and fire that was obviously burning back there in the bush.
It was pretty chaotic. There was a lot of people wandering around, a lot of walking wounded. Another fellow and myself actually rescued one of the guys that was trapped in the fuselage of the airplane by pulling apart a piece of the airplane and removing a body off of there.
The tragedy was later dramatized in the History Channel series Disasters of the Century.
For the moment, survivors must fend for themselves. The Fokker F-28 has broken into 3 pieces.
The episode focused on the ice buildup on the wings and the lack of safety regulations that became the centerpiece of the Air Ontario inquiry headed by Justice Virgil Moshansky. Thunder Bay lawyers Chris Knutson and Sandy Zaitsev represented dozens of passengers and victims at the high-profile inquiry, many of whom spoke about the problems and horrors they saw.
Their testimony was probably the most moving, the most graphic. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom day after day after day.
We were dealing with a huge emotional tragedy that involved so many families throughout northwestern Ontario. I mean, this was a plane that was filled with northwestern Ontario people.
Tina Tucker was among those who were too traumatized to take the witness stand, but she says the passage of time has made it easier to talk about the crash.
There's never been another feeling quite like that, because you're staring your mortality in the face.
In part 2 of this series, we'll hear more from Tina Tucker about coming to grips with the condition known as survivor's guilt and her vow to live life to the fullest after surviving the Dryden air crash. Jonathan Wilson, TBT News.
Continue our look back at the Dryden air crash as we mark the 20th anniversary of that catastrophe, which claimed 24 lives. In part 2 of a 4-part series, we hear from survivor Tina Tucker about the tremendous emotional toll many of them suffered in the years following the crash. Here's TBT's Jonathan Wilson.
2 decades after the Dryden air crash, Tina Tucker's memory of March 10, 1989 is still crystal clear. From the stewardess yelling at them to brace for impact, to the unforgettable smell of the jet fuel pouring down on her. She was just 26 years old when she boarded the Air Ontario jet.
You don't think about your mortality. I mean, really. You think life is endless at that age, and it stretches before you, and it was a very black feeling. That's the only way to describe it.
Her future husband helped pull her from the wreckage. She suffered several broken ribs from the debris that crashed down on her. 24 others lost their lives, many of them in the fire that consumed the aircraft. It all led to a condition known as survivor's guilt.
My injuries were more psychological, and I'm sure a lot of the survivors would probably say that. Knowing how many people died in the crash and how they must have suffered, and how much their families suffered afterwards.
Thunder Bay lawyer Chris Knutson, who represented many of the 45 survivors at the Air Ontario inquiry, says he saw firsthand the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Having acted for a lot of those people, I got to look at the destruction that it caused in their lives on a level other than the visible physical injuries. I mean, the emotional trauma scarred them forever.
I do remember the screams, though, and that, you know, I mean, that's... I don't know who decides, you know, who's going to live and who's going to not.
Tucker says although it was hard at first, she now considers herself lucky and blessed to have survived the crash. The experience made her determined to live life to the fullest, and admits she did a few things to make sure the month of March contains good memories as well.
The following March, we got married. The March after that, March of '91, my son was born. So there are really horrible memories in March, but I've also made some really awesome and memorable memories in March, quite deliberately.
Tucker's recovery also included getting back in an airplane again. About a year after the crash, she and her husband were joined by a priest and a doctor and took off in a small plane. She flew a few more times after that, but for the past 18 years, all the Tucker family vacations have been by car.
I know the statistics, that it's more likely that I am going to be in an automobile crash than a plane crash ever again, but it's really hard to tell yourself that when you're up there.
In part 3 of this series next week, we'll hear from 2 more of the survivors of Air Ontario Flight 1363, Donna Wilson, who kept some pieces of the wreckage from the doomed aircraft, and Dan Godden, who was awarded the Star of Courage for trying to rescue his fellow passengers. Jonathan Wilson, TBT News.
Tonight, we continue our look back at one of the worst disasters in the history of northwestern Ontario. The 1989 Dryden air crash was particularly devastating to Thunder Bay, with about 2/3 of the people on board from this city. In part 3 of a special 4-part series, TBT's Jonathan Wilson talks with 2 more of the local survivors about moving on after the crash.
Dan Godden doesn't often talk about it, but he's one of the true heroes of the Dryden air disaster. He and his wife Susan and daughters Lori and Danielle, who were just 11 and 15 years old when their flight to Winnipeg went down, are still reluctant to talk about the tragic event, even when they run into fellow survivors around Thunder Bay.
As a rule, no. We very frequently see people that were involved in the tragedy, and as a rule, we don't talk about it.
The crash killed 24 of the 69 people on board, but several of those 45 survivors can credit Godden for them making it out alive. The subsequent air crash inquiry revealed how Godden, after getting his family out, went back into the burning aircraft 12 times to evacuate injured passengers.
Several seconds the crash is over. That's the end of the crash. But the fire was terrifying.
Godden also helped emergency crews carry the injured out of the crash site through the deep snow. He was 37 years old at the time, and later received the Star of Courage from then Governor General Rain Natition for his heroic efforts on that horrifying day.
I would have to say we have found out after tragedy there is a life and there is happiness, and even though you never truly forget, you move on.
Donna Wilson was a young mother in her early 30s when she boarded the Air Ontario jet back in 1989. She too managed to escape the wreckage.
You sort of go, okay, I didn't die. The 2 people beside me, I have no idea where they went. And I calmly undid my seatbelt and walked out, and some guy helped me down, and then part of the plane blew up.
Wilson says the days leading up to the March 10th anniversary always bring flashbacks of that day. She still remembers the chaos in the moments after the plane went down, and the cold she felt as the passengers waited for what seemed like an eternity for rescuers to arrive. She also remembers a moment of bonding with her fellow survivors.
Actually, the first thing we did was light a cigarette. Covered in fuel, but we lit a cigarette. Okay, we were fine. It was a state of shock, I think. I think we were all just sort of standing there in state of shock, unless you were exactly right there where somebody needed help.
Wilson declined to speak as a witness at the air crash inquiry, but she did attend the proceedings when they were held in Dryden. She also got a chance to tour the crash site that summer of 1989 and found some charred metal pieces of the plane.
And I just sort of kept them, because I thought 20 years later, it's like, okay, yeah, I guess I did actually go through that. Like, it's almost like you don't believe that you actually went through it.
Perhaps surprisingly, Wilson and the Goddins were all back on airplanes within a year of the crash. Wilson actually took the same Air Ontario flight to Winnipeg as a way to help get over her post-crash trauma.
As a matter of fact, I sat in the cockpit, and it felt a lot safer up there than it did in the back. But I fly. I'm not a good flyer, but I fly.
We're all a bit apprehensive, probably even to this day, but it's something we managed to deal with and we're okay with.
In the fourth and final part of this series, we'll look at the lasting impact that the Dryden air crash and its resulting inquiry had on airline safety regulations right up to this day. And we'll hear more from the passengers about how watching some of the recent air crashes around the world still deeply affects them. Jonathan Wilson, TBT News.
20 years ago today, an Air Ontario jet crashed in a patch of forest near the Dryden airport, killing 24 of the 69 passengers on board. In the conclusion of our special four-part series, we look at the wide-ranging impact the accident had on air safety in Canada and talk to survivors about the latest crashes around the world. Here's TBT's Jonathan Wilson.
The survivors of Air Ontario Flight 1363 say they still get flashbacks whenever they see the latest plane crash on the TV news. In the past 2 months, there have been 3 major accidents, ranging from miraculous to completely catastrophic.
It's a sinking feeling. The first thing I think of is, if anybody makes it out of these, okay, they're in for a long, tough road.
As a survivor of an airline crash, it's almost a morbid curiosity that you tend to have when something like that happens. How could they let that happen again?
The Buffalo tragedy was particularly haunting, as that plane may have gone down after ice formed on the wings. The Dryden air crash was ultimately caused by a failure to de-ice that day, but the lengthy inquiry led by Justice Virgil Moshansky also uncovered a shocking lack of aircraft maintenance and staff training due to airline cost-cutting and reduced regulatory oversight. Moshansky's final report contained 191 recommendations, most of which have been implemented.
That achieved something in air safety that is unparalleled, unequaled. It had international ramifications.
Now they have end-of-runway de-icing, which they didn't have then, and they have very modern de-icing trucks that come around to all the aircraft, and that's a huge difference and something that I believe the inquiry put forward.
Dryden air crash survivors Donna Wilson and Dan Godden both think the present airline safety standards are higher than they've ever been.
Well, I think the Air Ontario inquiry was very comprehensive. I think the results of the inquiry were very positive, and I think it made an effect in our present day standards.
But there are concerns from some in Canada that safety standards are slipping again, including Moshansky himself. Over the past few years, a move by Transport Canada to allow airlines to create their own safety management systems has caused a ruckus among airline unions and opposition politicians in Ottawa. The changes also include an apparent shifting of duties for the dwindling number of government air safety inspectors. In 2007, Moshansky issued this warning: "History is repeating itself, only worse. We are on the slippery slope to another Dryden, especially if this oversight divesting is allowed to proceed." Air Ontario inquiry lawyer Chris Knutson says all Canadians must remain vigilant to ensure another tragedy doesn't occur here. And he says the Dryden air crash survivors can play a key role in advocating for airline safety.
There should be almost a willingness to remind by what happened by speaking about it. Because again, complacency sets in the industry and all the way along, and you have an issue.
Tina Tucker, who up until now has rarely talked publicly about the crash, agrees it's vital to remember the mistakes of the past.
It's because that's one thing that time does do. It tends to heal wounds, and and it helps people forget. And I don't want anybody to forget what happened on that day. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to do this interview, because, you know, I'd hate to think that something that terrible happened and we didn't learn good lessons and remember those lessons.
Jonathan Wilson, TBT News.
Meanwhile, the anniversary of the crash was marked in Dryden today. About 40 people attended a memorial near the community's airport to remember the victims who died back on March 10th of 1989. A rocky monument and bronze plaque, which were set up about 10 years ago, were rededicated just after noon today, the same time Air Ontario Flight 1363 went down in the forest less than a kilometre from the runway. Dryden Mayor Ann Krasowski and Airport Manager George Friesen took part in the ceremony. They say the accident, which claimed 24 lives, will never be forgotten there.
It was a very tragic time and in such a disaster of such huge proportions in the loss of lives, in the loss of so many the families that were affected. And when we look at the survivors, again, family and friends who have been so affected, and we look at the responders who responded so with care and compassion, and you have to remember that the day lives on in the lives of so many.
We tend to, as a society, mark 5, 10, 15, 20-year events. This is a 20-year event of a very, very tragic day in the history of not only Dryden but of Canada. And I think it's very important that we always take the time to remember those who perished and, more importantly, those who survived that terrible, terrible day.